Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Tomiko Brown-Nagin, Dean of the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study at Harvard University. I'm pleased to welcome you to the second installment in our series of summer virtual book talks. Before we begin today's talk, I want to take a moment to acknowledge all the members of the Radcliffe Institute Leadership Society and all our annual donors. Your generosity keeps Radcliffe programming free and open to the public, and we thank you. Today, I'm thrilled to be joined by the acclaimed author and journalist, Michael Pollan. Michael is the James S. and John L. Knight Professor of Journalism at the University of California at Berkeley, a professor of the practice of nonfiction, and Louis K. Chan Arts Lecturer at Harvard. And he was a 2015-2016 Suzanne Young Murray Fellow here at Radcliffe. During his fellowship, Michael worked on his fascinating 2018 book, How to Change Your Mind: What the Science of Psychedelics Teaches Us About Consciousness, Dying, Addiction, Depression, and Transcendence. Michael is the author of 5 New York Times bestsellers, and several of his books have been adapted for television. This afternoon, we'll discuss Michael's latest project, an audiobook titled Caffeine: How Coffee and Tea Created the Modern World. Caffeine examines the history of what Michael calls the most used drug in the world, an addictive chemical that has shaped our history, our economy, and how we work. Thank you so much, Michael, for joining us. We'll begin this afternoon with a brief reading, followed by a conversation. After that, we look forward to opening the virtual floor to you. Please use the Q&A feature on Zoom to submit your questions at any time during the program. We ask you that you keep your questions brief to allow us to address as many possible questions in the time that we have together. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Michael Pollan.
It's a pleasure to be here with you and to be back at Radcliffe, metaphorically. I had a wonderful year there and did a lot of writing and research, and just have the fondest memories of the institution and how much they supported me. I'm going to start out our book talk today by reading a passage. This is actually from the very beginning of the audiobook. Maybe the very first sentence isn't the best place to admit this. At the very moment you are deciding whether to lend me an hour or two of your attention, but halfway through the research for this story, I suffered a crisis of confidence that caused me to doubt the subject was of any interest at all, even to me, whose supposedly bright idea it was. I began seriously to doubt a long piece on caffeine was worth the time and effort it would take to report and write it, and to wonder why I had ever thought otherwise. I was in trouble. We were in trouble. Though you have an option I do not, you at least can stop right here. Before this crisis, I'd been chugging merrily along, conducting interviews, reading countless books of science. It turns out caffeine is one of the most studied psychoactive compounds there is, and history, the course of which was shifted decisively in the West by caffeine, traveling to South America to visit a coffee finca, tasting all manner of caffeinated beverages, when suddenly, like the road runner in the cartoon, I chanced to glance down and realized there was no more road underfoot, just a vast empty expanse of pointlessness as far as I could see. What in the world was I doing? Or perhaps it would be more accurate to ask, what was I not doing? Because something was going on with me just then that almost certainly accounts for this project's sudden loss of cabin pressure. I had stopped using caffeine, abruptly and completely. After years of a tall morning coffee, followed by several glasses of green tea through the day and the occasional cappuccino after lunch, I had quit caffeine, cold turkey. It was not something I particularly wanted to do, but I had come to the reluctant conclusion that the story demanded it. Several of the experts I was interviewing had suggested I really couldn't understand the role of caffeine in my life, its invisible yet pervasive power, without getting off it and then presumably getting back on. Roland Griffiths, one of the world's leading researchers on mood-altering drugs, and the man most responsible for getting the diagnosis of caffeine withdrawal syndrome included in the DSM-5, the Bible of psychiatric diagnoses, told me he hadn't begun to understand his own relationship to caffeine until he stopped using it and conducted a series of self-experiments. He urged me to do the same. The idea here is that you can't possibly describe the vehicle you're driving without first stopping, getting out, and taking a good look at it from outside. This is probably the case with all psychoactive drugs, but is especially true of caffeine, since the particular quality of consciousness it sponsors in the regular user feels not so much altered or distorted as normal and transparent. Indeed, for most of us, to be caffeinated to one degree or another has simply become baseline human consciousness. Something like 90% of humans ingest caffeine regularly, making it the most widely used psychoactive drug in the world, and the only one we routinely give to children, commonly in the form of soda. It's so pervasive that it's easy to overlook the fact that to be caffeinated is not baseline consciousness, but in fact is an altered state. It just happens to be a state that virtually all of us share, rendering it invisible. So I decided that for the good of the piece, that is to say for you, dear listener, I would conduct a self-experiment in abstention. What had never occurred to me when I began this experiment is that by giving up caffeine, I would be undermining my ability to tell the story of caffeine, a knot I wasn't at all sure how to untie. Maybe I should have anticipated the problem. The scientists have spelled out, and I had duly noted, the predictable symptoms of caffeine withdrawal: headache, fatigue, lethargy, difficulty concentrating, decreased motivation, irritability, intense distress, loss of confidence, and dysphoria, that is the polar opposite of euphoria. I had them all to one degree or another, but beneath the deceptively mild rubric of difficulty concentrating hides nothing short of an existential threat to the work of the writer. How can you possibly expect to write anything when you can't concentrate? That's pretty much all writers do. Take the blooming multiplicity of the world and our experience of it, literally concentrate it down to manageable proportions, and then force it through the eye of a grammatical needle, one word at a time. It's a miracle anyone ever manages this mental feat, or at least it seems that way on day 3 of caffeine withdrawal. But even before the writer can hope to confront and scale that sheer cliff of impossibility, he or she needs to muster the confidence, the sense of agency and power required to proceed. It hardly matters if it's a delusion, but that sense you have by the tail a story the world needs to hear, and you alone have what it takes to tell it, is precisely what you need to tell it. Forgive the masculine metaphor, but much depends on this mental tumescence. What I discovered is that it, in turn, depends in no small part on 1,3,7-trimethylxanthine, the tiny organic molecule known to most of us as caffeine. And so the piece begins.
Wonderful. That is such a great beginning, Michael. And I'm excited to dig into the topic of caffeine itself. But first, I want you to take a step back and tell us if this current project is related to the project that you worked on at Radcliffe, the book, How to Change Your Mind on Psychedelic Drugs.
Yeah, I mean, I've had this long-standing interest going really back to my first book, which was called Second Nature, in our relationship to plants and what we use plants for and how they use us in turn to advance their own, evolutionary project. I began as a writer in the garden, actually. And so I've been obsessed with this reciprocal relationship we have with plants for such a long time, and all the different uses to which we put them. Food is obvious, beauty is obvious, scent, flavor. But one of the most curious uses we put plants to is to change consciousness, to change the textures of our experience of the world and perceptions and imagination. And that has always struck me as odd and kind of wonderful. And I looked at cannabis in an early book, in Botany of Desire. And that's a lot of what the book on psychedelics is about, because several of the psychedelics are plant-based. Mescaline is produced by 2 cacti, for example. Psilocybin is produced by a mushroom, not exactly a plant. And that I think this is a very interesting area of human life that doesn't get enough attention, that the kind of consciousness that one civilization encourages or one culture encourages or discourages has a bearing on life in that world. And caffeine for us is in a way the most universal case of, you have just about everybody on earth using caffeine almost every day. And it shapes, as I said in that passage, our baseline human consciousness. So understanding that relationship has been with me for a long time. Psychedelics are the extreme case, and caffeine is the almost invisible everyday case. So I'd always had in the back of my head that I would get to caffeine eventually, and I was very happy when I got this opportunity, because it was a project that needed more space than an article, but I didn't want to write a whole book about it. And so the audiobook format, in a way, was kind of perfect because there's wonderful flexibility and length. And so this is not a book. I mean, they call it an audiobook. It's somewhere between a book and an article. It's 2 hours to listen to the whole thing.
And it's a wonderful listen. So thank you for writing it. So as you say, about 90% of humans ingest caffeine regularly. So it's a very personal a topic of personal relevance to the vast majority of people who are listening today and watching. Certainly it's relevant to me. You mentioned that, caffeine.
And to me, I'm still, I'm back on the sauce.
That's right. So you mentioned caffeine is introduced to kids. And I can remember being 12 or 13 years old and starting to drink the last few drops of my dad's coffee cup, from my dad's coffee cup every morning after he went to work. And so I very much appreciate the subject. So we drink coffee and tea when we wake up in the morning. We drink it to get a boost in the afternoon. But what you're explaining in this work is that caffeine is much more than a pick-me-up. You describe it as an addictive, psychoactive drug, one that affects our consciousness. And so I want you to break it down. What exactly do you mean by that? And should we be worried?
So, a lot of people, when they hear about this project, want to know, up or down. Is this a good thing for you or a bad thing? I think it's much more interesting than that. I don't have a lot of negative things to say about caffeine. There's one area of concern that we'll get to. But we tend to moralize drugs, and that the word drug has got a negative connotation. And that we assume if you're addicted to something, you're morally dissolute. But of course, we're addicted, we all have our addictions. We're addicted to technology, and we all have habits. This addiction, the question you have to ask yourself is an addiction to something that is legal, that is not harmful to your health, that you can easily get a hold of. Is that anything to worry about? Most of us have decided it's not, but I think a lot of us are not accustomed to hearing caffeine described as an addictive drug. But it is. The definition of that is basically if you withdraw from using it, you will suffer consequences, as I did. That there is a withdrawal symptoms that are unpleasant. They can last a few days, up to a week or two. But we all know what happens when we don't have our cup of coffee in the morning. And what's really interesting and slightly insidious about caffeine is that when you wake up in the morning, that first cup comes at the exact moment where withdrawal symptoms are just beginning to set in, and that the drug lasts long enough in your system that you can get through the night without it. But when you wake up, you need something, not so much to get a lift, although it feels like a lift to most of us, but to suppress the symptoms of withdrawal and get back to this baseline that caffeine has created for us. So, it's not an addiction that troubles me. But I'm open to using all sorts of medicines that have much more consequence in my research. I do think that consciousness changing substances are just a part of human nature. I mean, all cultures have had some plant or fungus they use to change consciousness, with one notable exception, and that's the Inuit in Greenland. And that was really because nothing good grew where they lived. As soon as the Inuit moved to Canada or the United States, they got with the program and they began using alcohol. And that's another one we all forget about. That is plant-based, and it's, fungal-based too, since it's the fungus that creates the alcohol. But that too shapes society. And in fact, one of the interesting things about caffeine is to the extent it replaced alcohol as the everyday and daytime drug in Europe, is really where it gets a lot of its impact. Because to go from alcohol to coffee, as we all know, is a pretty profound shift, and it has huge implications for work, for ways of thinking, for civilization.
Right. And I want to ask you a bit about your historical arguments. But first, I want you to say a little bit more about why we seem to get that lift. What is caffeine doing to our brains?
Yeah, so caffeine, as I said, it's very well studied, and we know a ton about it, which is really interesting. But basically, caffeine fits into a receptor that's all over the body, but concentrated in the brain, it's an adenosine receptor. Adenosine is a neurotransmitter. And adenosine, basically, over the course of the day, adenosine levels rise in your body. Adenosine gets the body ready to go to sleep. It's the signal that we're tired. It's the signal that we're losing kind of sharpness. And it's very important for closing things down at the end of the day. It builds what the researchers call sleep pressure. And what caffeine does is it fits perfectly into that receptor in such a way that it blocks adenosine. So you've got this neurotransmitter in the bloodstream flowing around, but it can't, the receptors are hijacked, so it can't get into them and activate the whole chain of events that leads to diminishing alertness and tiredness and the desire to go to sleep. So the adenosine hasn't left your body, but it can't get to the receptors. And so when finally you metabolize the caffeine, which takes several hours, you're more tired than you would have been otherwise, because the adenosine then comes in a flood and begins to drive up sleep pressure dramatically. So the question is the energy you feel from caffeine, and there is a kind of boost. It does have some other effects on the dopamine network and some other networks, but basically it's hiding your tiredness from you. And that suggests it's not really a free lunch as much as it seems like that you pay. There's some compensating extra tiredness you will get once the caffeine is worn off.
Right. And so let's talk about caffeine and sleep. You say in the book that after giving up caffeine, you slept like a teenager again. And you call Matthew Walker's book, Why, one of the scarier books you've read. And so I want to ask you to say more about how big is the impact of caffeine on sleep, and how important is that to our health?
Yeah, so you've gone right to the big negative of coffee, and that is that it does interfere with sleep. Even if you stop drinking coffee at lunchtime, it has a quarter life in your system. That means a quarter of it is still circulating 12 hours later. And I think the quarter life is even longer for women than it is for men. And this varies from person to person, but that's the general consensus. So what does that mean? Well, basically, there's a kind of sleep you need to have that the researchers call deep or slow wave sleep. This isn't REM sleep where you're dreaming. This is a even deeper place you go late in the sleep cycle. And it's very important to our mental health. It is the time when these slow waves originate in the front of our head and move back, and they kind of resynchronize or harmonize brain waves. And they help us basically put memories from the day where they should go. Think of it as cleaning the desktop of your computer and putting all the files in the right place. That's when this happens, and it's important to our well-being. And research suggests that having caffeine in your system, even a small amount of it, interferes with slow wave sleep. Add to this the fact that the amount of slow wave sleep you have diminishes naturally over time. The older we are, the less of it we get. And at a certain age, you can't afford to give up too much without paying a price. So Matt Walker, who is a colleague here at Berkeley in psychology, has written this book that many people have read called Why We Sleep, that, yes, is very scary, because he feels that sleep is one of the most important components of health and well-being, physical health and mental health. And that anything that interferes with it, which includes screens and alcohol interferes with with REM sleep, for example, are to be avoided. He's something of a caffeine scold or Puritan. And so that's one of the reasons I felt when I got off caffeine, the compensating virtue was I did sleep. I had fantastic sleeps for weeks and weeks and weeks. And that was wonderful. I'd forgotten what a great sleep is. And I'm not a bad sleeper, but I do wake up many times during the night. So bad sleep, however defined, is associated with lots of problems. Everything from Alzheimer's disease to heart disease to you just don't want to know the list. So it's an important component of good health, and caffeine interferes with it. To what extent? It's different for different people. I'm back on caffeine and I'm sleeping pretty well. I'm making a point of not, you have to remember it's 3 hours earlier here, of not, having caffeine late into the day. I no longer have that cappuccino after lunch, and I would never have coffee or anything caffeinated at dinner. So, I think you have to see how you metabolize caffeine. I've noticed in all my various pharmaceutical experiments that I seem to metabolize drugs very quickly. The times I participated in like ayahuasca circles, I'm like, fidgeting when everybody else is still journeying somewhere. So it may not be a big problem for me, I don't know. But it's definitely the issue to consider. You may have heard of other problems with caffeine, blood pressure, other cardiovascular issues, cancer. It's gotten a clean bill of health on everything else. In fact, it's actually protective against certain kinds of cancer. And it does a lot of good things for us. One of the most, so I'm trying to give you a somewhat balanced view.
Sure, yeah.
One of the most amazing facts I learned was that the single greatest source of antioxidants in the American diet, antioxidants are very important to protecting us against cancer, is coffee and tea. Now that's largely a measure of the fact we eat so few vegetables, I think, but the antioxidants we're getting through these two plants.
So thank you for that answer. So there are negative impacts on sleep, but you went back on it because it turns out that there are benefits to coffee as well, assuming that it's not consumed to excess. All good news, good to know. I wonder how you think about coffee as a cultural experience and the benefits of that. That is to not drink coffee is to lose this wonderful cultural experience of going into a coffee house or sharing a cup with a friend. I wonder if you think of that as particularly meaningful.
I do, although it's important to remember there's always decaf, and you can have a pretty enjoyable time going into a cafe and having a cup of decaf, and I've been reduced to that at various times. But coffee has, since the beginning, been a very social drug, and that the coffee house followed the discovery of coffee very quickly. This is both in the Arab world and then in Europe. When coffee arrives, coffee doesn't arrive in Europe till the 1600s to 1650s in England, a little earlier in Austria and Venice and places like that. And immediately people want to get together and have conversation. And coffee houses become these really vital, vibrant public spaces. In England, there were, at a certain point, there was a coffee house for every 200 Londoners. That's how popular they were. And people gathered here, and it was a very democratic space, which was interesting. Taverns had different rooms depending on your class, but anyone could sit anywhere. I say anyone. No women were allowed in coffee houses at the beginning. But any male, regardless of class, could sit wherever they wanted. They were very civil compared to taverns where people were getting drunk and fights were breaking out. If you started an argument in a coffee house in London, you had to buy the next round. And they were very political places. There was a lot of political conversations, so much so that Charles II, after the restoration of the king, tried to close them down. He thought that the coffee houses were too democratic, and there were sites where people were fomenting rebellion, or so he thought. So he issued an order to close down all the coffee houses. Well, guess what? People were so addicted, they simply ignored him, and the coffee houses went on uninterrupted. And he was kind of weak and didn't want to test his power by actually trying to close them down. So it's also important I think that's an interesting point to remember, that all psychoactive drugs at one time or another have been considered dangerous to the powers that be, even coffee. Coffee in the Arab world too was banned at various points. It was, these things are very threatening to the status quo, or perceived that way very often. But the efforts to ban coffee really didn't get a lot of traction.
Right. So let's continue with these historical and geopolitical arguments that you make in your work, starting with the idea that caffeine played a critical role in industrialization. You write that caffeine was the perfect drug for the rise of capitalism. Can you explain that?
Yeah, so I mentioned earlier about alcohol, and I don't think people realize just how drunk everybody was in Europe for most of the time. People drank alcohol morning, noon, and night. And there was good reason for it. Life was often miserable, but more relevantly, alcohol was safer to drink than water. And that's why, like, hard cider was given to children. The alcohol sanitized, to some extent, what was dangerous water to drink. And alcohol was fine as long as most of the labor was physical and outdoors. On farms and other outdoor work sites, there were beer breaks in England. So it was just kind of not something you just did in the evening. It was something that people were doing all day, but it was not conducive to working with machinery. It was not conducive to working with numbers or symbols. And you needed very different psychoactive as you move into capitalism, and things like keeping the books really matters, and you're industrializing, and now you have this machinery that's very dangerous to operate when you're drunk. The fact is that caffeine fosters a kind of consciousness which is very focused, very linear, very rational, that is the perfect accompaniment to the rise of capitalism and the Industrial Revolution. The other thing caffeine does that is so important is it breaks our dependence on the cycles of nature, and specifically the cycles of light and dark. The sun dictated so much about work for so long. You worked from dawn till dusk. The idea of a night shift or working all night long was unthinkable without a drug that would allow you to stay awake. So caffeine allows you to go to 2 shifts and 3 shifts, and that's a huge boon to capitalism. But I think the best evidence of caffeine's gift to capitalism is the coffee break. And in the piece, I tell the history of the coffee break. We take it as kind of something quite natural that always has existed, but it had to be invented, of course. And I tell the story of the company where it was invented, and they were having it was a necktie weaving company called Wigwam Weavers in Colorado, and they would do these intricate silk ties for men, and they had these young men who operated the looms. And when the war started, this is World War II, they lost their labor force. And they first tried hiring older men, but they could not get the precision or the focus to deal with all the different colors on the looms. And then they hired women who did a much better job, but would sort of get burnt out after 4 or 5 hours of work. So the owner convened a meeting of the women who worked there and said, how can we deal with this? We need greater productivity. And the women came up with the idea, well, give us some coffee and some time to drink it. And so he tried that and was amazed at how much more productivity and how much better the quality control was when he gave his employees caffeine. And so he instituted the coffee break. He then tried to dock the women's pay for that 20 minutes twice a day, and in fact was taken to court. And finally, it was ruled by a federal judge in the 1950s that the coffee break was part of the workday and that it more closely resembled work than leisure and benefited the employer as much as the employee. So therefore, companies are forced to pay for compensate the time during the coffee break. But that's kind of amazing that we've institutionalized a drug for the express purpose of improving productivity and quality control. But so we have, and workers are happy to have it, and so are employers.
Right, indeed we have. So I want to move to audience Q&A in a moment, but first I want to ask you about what you call the moral price of caffeine, the connection of coffee and tea to colonialism, slavery, displacement of indigenous people, and exploitation of laborers. Can you say a few words about that?
Yeah, I think many of us are not aware of or have only recently become aware with things like the fair trade movement of the brutality of the system that produces our coffee and often our tea. I spent some time in Colombia and I visited a coffee plantation to see how it's grown. It's really hard work. Coffee grows at a fairly high altitude. It likes to be on a steep, well-drained bank. It's a prickly plant and it has to be harvested by hand. And this is backbreaking work. Coffee was very involved early on in the slave trade. Brazil was the first major coffee producer, and they imported tremendous numbers of slaves from Africa to work on the plantations. In the case of tea, you had another kind of brutality. Tea became so popular in London, in England, and in fact, it really lubricated the Industrial Revolution. The workers subsisted on very sweet tea all day long as their main source of nutrition, as well as what kept them going for these, unconscionably long shifts and this brutal work. But England was getting all that tea. The East India Company was getting it from China, and had such a balance of payments problems because the Chinese would only take silver for it, that they had to come up with something to remedy it. And their solution was to start growing tea in India, which had never been a tea drinking country until the 1800s, and also to grow opium in India, which they then forced into China with enormously destructive effects on Chinese civilization. And the opium wars were fought on its behalf. So the addiction of this large European population and then American population to these two plants, if you trace back the lines of connection, you find some really unconscionable activities underlying this drug. I mean, today it's better. Obviously, we don't have slave labor growing our coffee or our tea, but in the free market, under neoliberalism, coffee has become a very volatile commodity. And so you see there are no price or supply controls as they were up until 1989, which gave some kind of certainty where prices were, and prices tended to be above the cost of production. Now you get countries, often at the behest of the World Bank or the IMF, suddenly planting, thousands of acres of coffee. Vietnam did this a couple of years ago, leading to crashes in the market that puts many, because it's mostly small farmers. I mean, it's a very hard kind of agriculture to industrialize. So it's, there's a good argument for buying fair trade coffee. It's not a perfect system, but it assures a better than market price, as well as often some environmental benefits like shade grown that are worth, I think, paying for.
Yes, wonderful. Thank you. So, Michael, let me bring in the audience here. We have some great questions, and I will start with this one. Given the complex history and nature of caffeine, why do humans view this psychoactive drug differently from other drugs that alter our consciousness? So the idea is, why is there so much cultural baggage around other drugs, but not around this one?
It's a really interesting question. I think the reason is that drugs that advance the social and economic system we have are celebrated, and drugs that get in the way are not. I mean, if you compare caffeine to psychedelics, which I've written about, psychedelics are very disruptive, unless you're microdosing, which now is like kind of supported in a lot of circles because it allows you to be, like coffee, more productive, more creative, more focused. I don't know if it really does or not, but that's the general belief. But LSD and psilocybin, all these things are stigmatized because they're threatening. And I think you can look through a lot of drugs and see that. There are certain drugs that are sedatives that people use to deal with the stresses of modern life, like alcohol, that are supported but have huge social costs. And then some of it is just the history of a given culture. It's interesting that there are cultures where caffeine is not, or alcohol, for example, in the Arab world is there are prohibitions on alcohol. Many religions have prohibitions on alcohol. Others use it in their sacrament. So it really depends, I think, on history. But in general, a drug that weaves so seamlessly into the economic system we have is bound to be approved of, and I don't think that's surprising at all. I mean, if caffeine disappeared from the world, it would be a real economic blow to productivity. It's something we should worry about, by the way, because climate change poses a serious threat to coffee production. I mean, some of the estimates I read that by the middle of this century, 50% of the land that currently grows coffee will no longer be suitable for coffee production. So yet another crisis on the horizon.
Thank you. Great answer. So let's continue on coffee and culture by asking you this question. Did you interview many people who never ingest caffeine, or did you, in the process of your research, come upon cultures that don't use or disapprove of caffeine? Yeah,
so I did interview some people who don't use it, and they're a little different than we are. I don't know exactly how to put this, but it's they're calmer very often. There's some very good things about not using caffeine. But I didn't go into it in great detail because I had my own self-experiment. I decided I would be the guinea pig for non-caffeine use. And, I talked a little bit about that in that passage I read. In general, I think I was mellower than I am normally. I did feel like I was off a step in conversation. I wasn't as quick off the mark. And it's funny. I mentioned in the piece that not drinking caffeine, not having it in my system, made me feel a little like this woman I dated in college, who had never watched television. There was no TV in her house, and she never got the jokes. She never got the allusions and the references that everybody else was making. And she always felt a little bit foreign to us and us to her. And so there's that little catch, I think, among people who don't drink it. People may feel that's really unfair, and I apologize if that's the case, but that's my general impression. And it's certainly how I felt.
Okay. Another question, is it really baseline human consciousness, that is the state of being caffeinated, if the caffeine high wears off and then you go about your day? Many of us prefer to go through the day with a kickstart, but most of the day we're not in the thick of a caffeine high. How would you respond to that?
Yeah, I think you don't feel the high, but you've had two things have happened. The suppression of withdrawal has happened. You're like clear for the day because you've got enough in your system. But as I said, it's a 12-hour quarter life, and that caffeine that is still circulating and is circulating all day long from your morning cup is affecting you. I think it's in subtle ways, and if you want to see exactly how, I really encourage everybody to get off caffeine and just to see what it's like, and that you do feel slightly different all day long, even after the withdrawal. And if you want to avoid the withdrawal, by the way, I didn't want to avoid it because I wanted to write about it, what it felt like. But it's pretty easy to avoid the withdrawal if you taper off. So if you go from, a full caffeinated cup to half calf to quarter calf over the course of a week, you can get off coffee without a serious withdrawal syndrome. And then you'll see for yourself. But you feel your baseline feels different.
So, Michael, there's a question about whether you've encountered the phenomenon of people who don't seem to be affected by caffeine. Or even the opposite, that caffeine makes them sleepy or affected differently at different times of day.
Yeah, there's a lot of variability in how caffeine affects people. There are people who get incredibly stimulated by caffeine, and they get really jittery on a small amount of it and don't find it pleasurable for that reason. And then I haven't met anyone that isn't affected. I can't think of someone I met who told me that, no, it has no effect on me whatsoever. But people metabolize it at very different rates. And I have talked to people who feel like it is really out of their system quickly. And there are people who get by on a very small amount of caffeine. But as I pointed out when I was talking about tapering, it doesn't take a lot to suppress withdrawal. So if you don't want to be so dependent on caffeine, you can experiment with simply reducing the amount you get. And the other thing that's another argument for getting off caffeine, it's so great getting back on. The first cup after you've been off is the best way to reacquaint yourself with what a powerful drug this is. And this is something that so many researchers have told me, that with your relationship with any of these psychoactives, and this goes for alcohol too, getting off is a really good way to study what it does to you, how it makes you feel. Do you like paying the price that comes with it? Because there is always a price. Mm-hmm. And we should assess this. We shouldn't, blindly and automatically go through our lives dependent on these plants, dependent on, these substances, without taking stock occasionally. And that's kind of, some people do these Lent fasts or January fasts where they get off coffee or they get off alcohol or whatever. And I think that's a really salutary thing to do. You learn a lot about yourself, and you learn a lot about how powerful these plants are.
Mm-hmm. Another question. Coffee, roasted properly and prepared correctly, is delicious. And the question is that deliciousness a product of its desire to affect human biology? In other words, would we drink it for its effect if it tasted like lye?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So a lot of, Roland Griffith, the researcher I mentioned in the passage I read, who's has studied coffee more than anything else, believes that it is a reinforcer. like many, many drugs, especially the drugs that affect the dopamine system, which caffeine also does, so that the flavor associated with that experience changes our perception of that flavor. So look how children react to coffee or tea. They find it very bitter. We generally don't like bitter foods and drinks. But since we associate it with this lift we get, we've come to love the taste. This goes for, he used the example of scotch. And he said, scotch doesn't taste good to anyone who doesn't, who, for the first time. It's not until you've had the associated mental experience that you learn to like the taste. And he argues this is exactly why caffeine is put into soda. If you put caffeine into anything, you will sell more of it because people will associate the feeling they have from it with the flavor of it. So he did some experiments on whether people could tell the difference between the taste of caffeinated versus uncaffeinated sodas, because the industry claims that the reason they put caffeine in soda, which is mostly drunk by children, is that it has a certain bitter taste that's part of their taste formula. This is complete horseshit. They put it in to addict people to it because they're allowed to. And when the FDA tried to regulate it, Roland Griffith did some experiments to show that no one can tell the difference in taste of caffeine versus non-caffeinated soda, but they do develop a preference for any soda that is caffeinated. And that's why all but, like, I think it's 7-Up and one or two others are caffeinated. It's remarkable that we allow an industry to put an addictive drug in something that we feed our children, but the FDA has never been able to get on top of it.
Fascinating. Michael, there's a question about the competitive advantage of coffee drinking, and it's if 90% of Americans are using caffeine on a regular basis, am I at a disadvantage if I give it up?
Well, that's a good question. I don't know. I mean, in some ways you might be. I mean, if you're working in a caffeinated workplace and you're a little slow off the mark, on the other hand, you might be sleeping better and have the clarity that comes with a good night's sleep. I think that's a question we have to answer individually. Competitive disadvantage. Well, you're thinking like a caffeinated person.
Yes, competitive advantage, yes. Other good questions. Does decaffeinated coffee still have an impact on the body? And what do you think about decaf as an alternative?
I think decaf is a really good alternative, and the quality of decaf has gotten a lot better. Some decafs are, I think, really tasty. I still drink half calf. I mix half decaf with my coffee because I like to drink more of it than I should, and so the fact that it's dilute with decaf is good. But it's important to remember decaf does have caffeine in it. It has a small amount. And it may be enough to suppress withdrawal symptoms. Also, some decafs, for example, Starbucks decaf has an appreciable amount of caffeine. I think it has about 1/3 of a normal cup's caffeine. So one way to sell more decaf is to add more caffeine, and Starbucks appears to do that. Yeah, I think it's a perfectly good alternative if you've developed a taste for coffee and don't want to get so much caffeine. What some people do too is, if they drink multiple cups of coffee in the morning, is make the second one decaf and make the first one caffeinated.
Okay, so Michael, there's a question about whether tea is the same, caffeine consumed through tea is the same as caffeine consumed as coffee. That is the same in terms of biological impacts, etc.
So it's the same chemical, but it is at lesser concentrations. So for example, the average cup of tea, if you have an 8-ounce cup of tea and an 8-ounce coffee, will have half as much caffeine. So arguably you're getting less caffeine, although tea drinkers drink more. So they probably end up in the same place. Caffeine is, there are other compounds in tea as well as other compounds in coffee, and these have some effect, some health effects, some of them quite good. There's a compound in green tea that supposedly evens out the caffeine so you don't get a jolt and it's released more slowly in the body. I wasn't able to pin that down, but, and there are other compounds in green tea that are very regarded as very helpful and protective against cancers and things like that. Green tea has less caffeine than black tea. Oolong is in the middle, and white tea has even less caffeine than green tea. So one way to, adjust your dial for caffeine is with the different kinds of tea that you drink.
Mm-hmm. Very good. Very interesting question here about whether you've encountered in your research discussions about caffeine's potential impact on mental illnesses, particularly how caffeine might interplay with anxiety or depression.
Yeah, so, and caffeine does engage with those phenomena. I mean, anxious people get more anxious on caffeine, and people who suffer from anxiety should generally avoid it. It's a pretty reliable way to reduce anxiety is to not use caffeine. And there is a DSM diagnosis for, I think it's caffeine use disorder, and it's characterized by people who get very anxious on caffeine, and that is a significant subset of the population. Even a little bit of caffeine will make them very nervous. People who are depressed tend to use more caffeine. Alcoholics use more caffeine. There's a relationship between alcoholism and coffee, and it may be that I don't understand it that well, but it may be that alcoholics need caffeine more in the morning to help them get back to baseline. It is not true, though, that black coffee is an antidote for drunkenness, that it sobers people up. That's simply not the case. I think that's a myth that goes back to this idea that coffee and alcohol were in this seesaw relationship, and as you saw more use of coffee, you had less use of alcohol.
Michael, there's a question here about whether you think it's ethical for employers to provide coffee.
Yeah, I don't see why it isn't. Especially if they provide time in which to drink it. Are they manipulating their employees? Yeah, it's one of the many ways that they're manipulating their employees, I'm sure. But I don't see an ethical problem with that. I mean, it'd be weird if we insisted they disclose it. And they had little advisories on the coffee cups or the coffee urns saying, this is being provided to help you work harder and longer. I think it would take some of the pleasure out of it. I think the coffee break is an institution, for whatever its history, the fact that it, helps the boss man more perhaps than it helps you. I think it's still a great institution. I would want to do nothing to get in its way.
So the last question I want to ask you, coming from the audience, is about your writing process and how writing for the auditory medium may have changed your typical process.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I had a lot of fun writing for audio. I think it puts a premium on storytelling and finding narrative, and that's one of the reasons I did these experiments on myself, to give a kind of a narrative laundry line that you'd be curious, like, how am I doing off coffee? What was it like when I got back on coffee? It creates, I think the storytelling virtues of narrative and suspense are more important in audio than not. I also think I went through the piece after it was written to look for those really long sentences that simply don't read well aloud. And also, there's certain words we use on paper in books that we don't use in conversation. And I went through the piece and killed all those words. That just, there may be a few of them left, but there's a kind of diction that is acceptable in print that I don't think works that well in audio. I liked the whole experience. I enjoy reading my work, aloud, which, I did the voice for the audio. But I also like the length. I think it's a really nice form. You can kind of sprawl. I mean, magazine articles have gotten so short. The New Yorker will seldom take anything over 6,000 words. And this is 21,000 words. So it's, I think it's an exciting form, and I'm glad that Audible is doing these original pieces, that I don't know where else, where I would have done it. As it happens, though, I will be publishing this in a book. I'm going to expand it somewhat, and I'm doing a book of 3 different psychoactive plants that will come out next summer under, I hope, the title, This Is Your Mind on Plants.
Oh, I love it. Great. Thank you, Michael, for being with us today and for sharing your eye-opening work. I also want to thank our audience for the excellent questions. I hope that many of you will join us for our next book talk on Tuesday, August 4th, when the novelists Margot Livesey and Gish Jen, both alumna of the Radcliffe Fellowship Program, will engage in conversation about Gish's newest novel, The Resistors. You can find more information about our upcoming events, along with videos of our past programs, at radcliffe.harvard.edu. Thank you again for joining us.